Having laid the philosophical and biblical framework down, the foundation down, about how to think about nation states and their moral standings as corporeal entities, we can begin to look at some specific examples of battlefield conduct utilized by the nation of Israel in their military tactics. And that's the context of which I'm talking about here, of corporeal guilt of nation states and their citizens as unified bodies, and how that plays a factor in how nation states interrelate with each other from a biblical point of view. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to look at an adversary nation in war and accurately judge the status of their corporeal wickedness, or to see just how far that wickedness permeates in their society. Indeed, it's difficult to measure such things because of all the factors that play into it. Israel had the help of the omniscient God himself to give them the perfect judgment calls on such matters. But when God is not present with leaders of a nation in the same way he was with Israel in the Bible, then leaders have to rely on very prudent wisdom to make such judgment calls. It is because of these things that it is so utterly important that a nation elect for themselves leaders who are exceedingly wise, because these are not easy things to decide. They are very weighty matters with huge consequences. And wisdom is one of the hallmarks of a leader that the Bible says is a blessing. When a wise leader doesn't have the immediate revelation of God to tell him how to act or behave towards an adversarial nation in warfare, or what the exact status of wickedness the adversarial nation stands in, the wise leader has to resort to heuristic judgments in his application of military tactics and warfare. Heuristics is the science of close estimations and approximations that are reflections of a deeper reality, even when the deeper reality cannot be accessed or easily known. When God told Israel the true reality of the wickedness of Canaan, that gave Israel the deeper reality of Canaan that they wouldn't have otherwise known without God's help. But if God doesn't tell a leader such things, when that leader is at war with another nation, that leader is prudent to rely on the heuristic of judging whether or not his military strategy and attacks on that adversary are reasonable enough to address the specific aggression he wants to stop, if his attacks are proportional with the level of wickedness or danger that adversary poses. He uses heuristics like knowing if his strategy is necessary to implement if there are other strategies that could accomplish the same thing, if the attack he wants to put in or the strategy he wants to posture is going to cause more damage than what is commensurate with the strategic goal wanting to be attained is worth. All of these are heuristics. All of these and more a leader needs to weigh in order to judge wisely his posture towards an enemy nation in war. And these heuristics, these heuristic questions and answers and judgment protocols can be guided by the principles taught in the Bible about how God told Israel to posture themselves militarily and what strategies to implement in different circumstances. Such matters and judgment calls are not things only applicable and localized to the Old Testament, but are applicable for all nations of all times. God himself describes these realities when he deals with and addresses nations as nations, when he judges, blesses, or punishes people as corporeal nation states. And also, though, many Christians want to relegate all these things to the Old Testament as if they don't have any bearing on reality today, but that isn't what the Bible says. In Judges chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war to teach war to those who had not known it before." Here, the Bible is saying that God has something to teach us about the nature and ethic of war. We can't just look at the battles of Israel and pretend like they have nothing to do with Christians in the modern day. The Bible doesn't allow us to do that. And being that we are a part of the subsequent generations after Israel, we need to learn from these stories the lessons about warfare that God has left in these stories for us to learn instead of being ashamed of them or embarrassed by them. One thing we can conclusively deduct thus far in this series is that the principle of including non-combatants in targeted attacks on an enemy nation is not, in and of itself, a wrong thing. Sometimes it would be wrong, and sometimes it is justified depending on the situation. And we'll go through some of these situations to get a clearer picture on that. But for now, I just want to establish that in principle, it is not wrong. How can it possibly be wrong when God himself ordered it under certain conditions and then told us here in Judges that he wanted us to learn from it? And not only learn from it, but learn that it is a legitimate and moral tactic at times. For example, during World War II, there is plenty of examples of how the Allies utilized this very tactic against the enemy, such as, for example, in Hiroshima. The nuclear attack there was much more devastating than any one attack Israel could have carried out on any of their enemies. And yet atheists, and those who are the most hostile to the Bible, because of this tactic God commanded in the Bible, are always silent about the fact that it was because of these tactics that the Allies were able to defeat Nazi Germany and Japan and win the war in the first place. As soon as these hostile atheists are pressed on the matter, they end up revealing themselves to be nothing more than hypocrites. Christians have no reason to be ashamed of these stories and lessons. They are inherent to our redemptive history and the roots of our Christian faith and the God we serve. This is reinforced by Stephen before he preaches the gospel, connects it with the important history of Israel, and includes in that historical sermon in Acts chapter 7, verse 45. He says, "Our fathers in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers." Paul does the same thing in the book of Acts chapter 13. After reading the law of Moses, he includes in his sermon in the New Testament, to the New Testament church, he included warfare stories. When he said in verse 19, he said, "And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, God, or he, gave them their land as an inheritance." Now, I presented these things to my pastor at one point, and I said that based on these things, I couldn't possibly say that the nuclear attack on Hiroshima was an evil thing in and of itself. Now, he didn't like hearing that, and he immediately disagreed with me, so I clarified my statement and I said, what I mean is, the attack on Hiroshima may have been wrong, but I can't possibly say it was wrong on the basis that it killed men, women, and children within its blast radius, because the inclusion of men, women, and children in military attacks is a tactic God gave to Israel. The question on whether it was an appropriate option for Japan specifically, given so many factors, that's another question altogether. So it may have been wrong because it was not commensurate. It was not a commensurate option to utilize against the level of wickedness or threat posed by Japan. But if Japan did have a level of wickedness or threat level high enough to merit the inclusion of non-combatants and entire families as a punishment for the actions of their nation, then I cannot say it was wrong. And another thing, Hiroshima is definitely not an example of civilians merely being collateral damage of an attack. No, Hiroshima is an example of civilians being the target. The nuclear bomb was invented and designed not to be only for military targets, mind you. More bombs than just the nuclear bombs were used and implemented for the sole purpose of attacking non-combatant families during World War II, and by the Allies, no less. Hiroshima is just one example. You also have the bombings of Dresden or the bombings of Hamburg. All these things where the Allies saw the war against these nation states as a war against the people themselves. And it was because of this judgment and action that the Allies were successful in their campaigns against Nazi Germany. But not every military conflict merits such a military posture. Sometimes it is wrong to implement this strategy because an adversary may not merit it. And we're going to look at one of those examples in the Bible in our next episode.